straight away in that summit. I hope you agree that this is a very beautiful looking book, yes? However, it is actually a picture of spermy slime that you are looking at. So just do not be under any illusions. It's not good. Just a few words on Sheila Jeffreys, who I think probably does not need an introduction. I think Sheila is without question one of the, if not the most important contemporary feminists from the UK. If you look at Sheila's work, going back to her first book called The Spinster and Her Enemy, and then progressing through important books like Lesbian Heresy, Anti-Climax, Beauty and Misogyny, up to the trans issue in 2014, quite an early book, Gender Hurts. There's also a book against God in there that people don't really know all that much about. There's an important book called on queer ideology. And so those of you who did not have the privilege of being born early, it's not your fault, you know. You missed out on the women's liberation, but still, it's not your fault. Reading all of Sheila's books and then her 2021 autobiography, Trigger Warning, guides you actually through the various stages and the various very topical issues that have preoccupied especially radical feminists. So I can highly, highly encourage you to read all of Sheila's last books. And then, of course, finish with reading the latest, the Penile Imperialism one. And I actually think that is one of the most important books that Sheila has written. It is actually the theory that underpins a lot of the horrible, horrible practices, like Melinda Tankert's book that gets launched tomorrow about He Chose Porn Over Me, and Caitlin Roper's book Sex Dolls. Because I think unless you understand the hold that men have over women because they have the sex right, you don't really understand why things are not getting better and in fact are getting worse. So I think it's crucial that you should read this book and pass it on to everybody. And I think congratulations to Sheila for an extraordinary book. Julia Long will give sort of her impressions on Sheila's book. Julia Long is also a national treasure, and how lucky I am to share the floor with two national treasures, and there are quite a few sitting in the audience as well, like Chalna Hammer in the front here, who started with us, well, a lot of us. And Julia wrote her PhD on the resurgence of the anti-pornography movement in the UK, and that then became a book. And I saw a copy down in the bookshop. So, more books to buy. Over to you, Julia.
Although Sheila does delve into some of the most grim and distressing aspects of what Mary Daly called the state of atrocity, although she does that very unflinchingly, my overriding feelings when reading this book were actually of sheer relief and gratitude that this book had been written. And I think the relief comes from reading such a clear analysis that that I feel that this is a book that certainly over the past 10 years or so has been crying out to be written. And I think, in my humble opinion, I think there was no one else that could write it other than Sheila. And why do I think it was crying out to be written? Well, I could talk about some of the things that I'm sure if you haven't already read it that you will enjoy about the book, such as that clarity of analysis, the lucidity and elegance of Sheila's writing, and also her wit, and if I may say, perhaps it's rather a British trait, that kind of a rather ironic sense of humour, and the being the mistress of the wry comment and the wry aside that did actually make me laugh out loud, especially in the early part of the book on the sexologist. But I think over and above that, what I appreciated so much about this book was the insistence on the political nature of the kinds of things that Renate was talking about that are these days seldom understood as being political, as being about power. And I think why this book is so important is that it absolutely, unequivocally puts the politics back into sexual politics. And I imagine that Sheila's time over, many years, if not decades, is working in political science has made her very, very well placed to do that. But I do think that only Sheila could have written this book, because her scholarship, and I think maybe it's already, it's been said before, but some of the previous titles that Renate mentioned, I think almost serve as kind of chapters that then kind of culminate in this book, because Sheila's scholarship, going back easily over a century to the work of the early sexologists, means that she can give that historical perspective to some of the phenomena that we are seeing really, that are far more becoming normalised and mainstreamed these days. And of course, not only does her scholarship span that kind of historical time span, but the last 50 years of it, Sheila has lived through herself as a really important voice in the women's liberation movement, and not just as an observer, but as someone who has continually been documenting, been analysing, been involved with, been leading, been elucidating the kinds of things that she talked with in this book. So I felt, as I was reading this book, that I had a direct pipeline to the insights and the brilliant insights of the women's liberation movement. And obviously there's been a great sort of amnesia about a lot of that, and I think this book does such a service in directing us straight back there, and obviously, of course, reviving that analysis, updating it, and using it to examine some of the more recent phenomena that Sheila talks about. So just a couple more things, because I know we want to get onto the conversation. I too also was very struck by the title. If you haven't yet got the book, or if you're if you're going to be waiting for your copy to arrive, I would recommend to you, if you do a Google search of Sheila Jeffreys' Penile Imperialism, apart from this book, it will direct you back to a 1976 essay that Sheila wrote with a woman called Natasha Hudson, I believe, that you can see, and you can see this term. I must admit, I've never seen this term used by anybody else. And you can see the original analysis that was being developed there almost 50 years ago. So I really recommend that you do that and have a look at that while you're awaiting this copy. But I think the use of that word imperialism is so important and such a key move in terms of elucidating these pretty grotesque phenomena that Sheila talks about. Because if we think about what that word imperialism means, it means something along the lines of a policy and practice of extending power and dominion by territorial control, or by gaining political and economic control, and it always involves the use of power. So that word imperialism is so crucial, and I think that is what has been missing for those of us who've been, in this movement, in these sort of various campaigns, fights, struggles in recent years. I think it's such a really important thing to put that word as such a central concept to our understanding of what this is all about. And of course, the way that Sheila does that is by bringing in this idea, or observing the reality of men's sex right. And so Sheila talks about male sexuality and male sexual violence right at the beginning of the book. She locates it very assertively in the context of male domination. Right at the beginning of the book, she says, "This book starts from the understanding that the form that male sexuality takes is socially constructed from the power relations of male domination. Male sexuality is a ruling class sexuality." And a little bit later on she says, "Male sexuality should be understood as a construction from and expression of male dominance." Now that might seem, we all use the term patriarchy or male domination all the time, But she then goes on to examine exactly how the male sex right then enacts this domination across a whole range of different phenomena that are usually treated as these kind of separate entities. So the kind of everyday sex, or the everyday sort of coercive sex of inverted commas heterosexual relations, looking at pornography, prostitution, sexual harassment, child sexual abuse, the normalisation of what's become known as kink, of sadomasochistic practices and other sexual fetishes, and also, of course, the trajectory of transgenderism. And I think what she does so beautifully in that sort of latter half of the book, where she's looking at all these really horrible things, is that she sees the underlying commonality of the men's sex right at the heart of all these things that are usually compartmentalised and treated as separate. And as she quotes Patrizia Romito, the Italian feminist theorist, that connectivity is the necessary basis of feminist understanding. And I think this book does such an absolutely brilliant job of bringing all of these horrors together and demonstrating what they're all about so powerfully. So I hope that many women read this book. I hope that many of us talk about it, share it. I won't say disseminate it for obvious reasons. I hope it gets shared, discussed. I hope that we create different forums and platforms for these ideas and this analysis to be brought into the centre of the kinds of things that are being talked about all this weekend. I should just mention again, if you Google Sheila Jeffreys, if you do a YouTube search, there are already some brilliant talks. There was the Spinifex launch recently. There have been talks on WDI, Radical Feminist Perspective. So there's already quite a lot that you can see. But obviously we have some such opportunity now. So I'd like to begin by asking Sheila if she can tell us a bit more about the main argument of the book and how she chose to structure the book and why she chose to structure it in that way. So Sheila.
I must say, in response to Julia's talk, that I'm always astonished that women think that what I write is funny. I'm never intentionally funny, ever. It's just who I am. And I write about all these awful, awful, awful things, and then women who read the book say, "Hey, you're so funny." Yes, so in terms of the book, I'll just say something about why I wrote it. I mean, one of the reasons, obviously, with the title Penile Imperialism is, as I think Renate suggested, to bring the 1970s to now. The extraordinary analysis that was created by radical and revolutionary feminists in the 70s and in the 80s of male violence and male sexuality has been largely forgotten. It's little referenced, so I've got a huge amount of citations in this book. And so I wanted to bring that up to the present so that women joining this movement now, younger women who know nothing about it, will get a really thorough grounding. And what we all did does not disappear. So that's a very, very important first reason that I wrote it. But also, in terms of transgenderism, I felt that I needed to return to the topic because, of course, I wrote Gender Hurts, and that was published in 2014. And I said then that it is sexual. It's a sexual fetish. I was very clear about that in the book. But that is still, I know it's extraordinary, but that is still controversial, that men actually dressing women's clothing for erections. It's still hard to say. I think it's one of the reasons, because I do say it all the time. I'm not always very popular, and there are places that will not platform me and not allow me to speak because I speak about the rude stuff, and I do, and that's kind of fundamental to my whole life's work, is to speak about the rude stuff. And I often have thought in the past, I mean, it's a bit like, when I'm communicating with women, I'm sending a dirty postcard, which some do not wish to receive, right? So sometimes I think that limits my popularity. But what I knew I needed to do was show really clearly that transgenderism is a sexual paraphilia or sexual perversion, and fit it into the whole history of the construction of male sexuality over the last 100 years, so that nobody could have any doubt anymore. There'd be no women saying, well, there are true trans who really have, some gender identity dropped by the stalk in their head when they're 85 years old, even though it never happens to women. There is just some mysterious thing. So I thought I wanted to write a book that would help to lay that crazy idea to rest by putting transgenderism in the whole history of the construction of the perversions and male sexuality. So the book is called Penile Imperialism, the Male Sex Right and the Subordination of Women, because what I seek to explain, as Julia was saying, is that there is a male sex right, and of course I could have written much more than this book, and I've written many other books on prostitution and trafficking and so on that are all about the male sex right. But in this one I wanted to show quite specifically how the male sex right works to control women's behaviour, to control how they can be and think about themselves, how they can live in their everyday lives, and how the perversions are being constructed to allow men to do all the kinds of access they want to do, like, the poor women married to nappy fetishists who are being required to clean their blooming nappies. I mean, it's extraordinary. But that's what's happening out there. And these men are living in houses with children where they've got nurseries on the bottom floor where they fill their nappies and the wives have to clean them. Now that's kind of extraordinary, but that is the male sex right in its most extensive form. And of course transgenderism, the idea that men have to be able, so that they can have erections and ejaculate, to go into the women's toilets and get used tampons to stick up their bottoms, which they do. And they need to be able to go in the women's toilets and masturbate and put it on YouTube and all of that. This is the male sex right in operation, but we all have to be so terribly, 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 terribly polite and not mention it, right? Which is kind of extraordinary. So the first half of the book looks at the way the male sex right operates in various spheres, in the construction of what sex is, and we're going to talk a bit more about that later on. In everyday sex, what I call everyday sex, which is the ordinary marital relationship or ordinary heterosexual relationship, which is about the enforced sex and the requirement of access to women, whether they like it or not. And then there's a chapter on prostitution, which I know a lot of you think, well, I've written so much on prostitution, how could I have ever anything new? I've tried to put in a couple of new things. And then the fourth chapter is on male sexuality and social control, and it is marvellous that Jalna is here, because Jalna was very involved way back when in the 70s in working on male sexuality and social control and violence against women and social control. It was your thing, absolutely. So so that's very nice that Jalna is here today and in the front row to hear this. And in the second half of the book is about the male sexual perversion, sexual paraphilias, showing how they have been developed in the last 50 years, which is pedophilia, sadomasochism, nappy fetishism, of course, but that's a new one, and transgenderism, and a few other little bits and pieces thrown in.
One of the things that I was really struck by and impressed with was your discussion of consent and the consent model early on, I think in chapter 2, which I found so important, and that's why one of the reasons why I really hope a lot of women read this book, because I think there's a lot of maybe a lot of us felt that there's something wrong with this model, that it's kind of relied on so heavily in campaigns and sex education. It's seen as being this kind of good thing, that as long as there's consent, then it's fine. And so I think one of the things you talk about in the book is the NUS campaign, I Heart Consent, and I remember seeing some T-shirts saying consent is sexy, and all of this. Yes, I know, all of this kind of thing, and it is so relied on from the legal definitions, and then, as I say, even in things like campaigns and sex education and all kinds of things, women's services. And I just love how you totally drive a coach and horses through that term and show just how much of a problem it is. So could you say a bit about that, please, about your analysis of that?
Yes, sure, thanks. And I've taught and written about consent before, so over many years, and tried to teach students about the problem with it as well. Because, of course, the idea of consent actually describes a form of male-dominant sexuality and sexual use and abuse of women, which is kind of extraordinary. People seem to think that consent is a nice thing, and that actually, as long as there's consent, everything is good. But I do explain that consent is normally something you have to give to serious surgery, because potentially you could lose the wrong leg, right? Now so consent is something that's used in a situation professionally where something's going to be done that could harm you very, very badly, right? So it's an extraordinary concept to use in the area of sex, which is supposed to be something to do with love, and it shows us that actually sex is not to do with love. So what I explain in the section on consent, I use a lot of wonderful work by feminist researchers over the years, going back to Diana Russell in 1970s, where women are using the words of women. They've collected what should we call it, the ovariotomy of women, because it can't be the testimony. I mean, it's tricky, this language is tricky. So they collect the ovariotomy of women, or whatever it is, and point out how absurd the idea of consent is, because, I mean, in Diana Russell's wonderful original work, she pointed out that 1 in 7 women was used with the threat or use of force sexually by their male partners, but in fact, the great majority of women had experienced forms of extreme pressure from their husbands, which meant there was absolutely no way. And there were women saying things like, "It was my honeymoon the first night and I didn't want to ruin it." I mean, isn't that extraordinary? So forced sex happens at the very... And then I've got other women, like a book from 2003 by a women's studies professor who interviewed her students, I think 23 students, and they said things like, "Well, I was crying." I mean, it's extraordinary. And the women's studies students were very young. There's also work on older women, and it's still going on. There's actually been no change in any of that. So my assumption is, of course, there's no statistics to tell us this exactly, that the vast majority of women who are in relations with men have done sex they didn't want, at least sometimes, often, very, very, very often, if not pretty much all the time, right? They're not expected to do the gardening or read a novel or anything of that kind, although I do have my wonderful sexologists in there talking about women who would, whilst being penetrated, paint their toenails or read a novel. Isn't that wonderful? There are acts of resistance that are so terrific. Anyway, so I talk about consent and how this creates a model of sex which is based on the male sexual imperative, or the male sexual initiative. So women are objects on which the male acts. The women are not expected to like it or have any pleasant response or whatever. They only get the choice to consent to something which is likely quite unpleasant and that they don't really want to have happen. Based on the male initiative. Imagine if there wasn't the male initiative. Imagine not much would be taking place in heterosexuality. Right? We know that's the case. Okay, so the male initiative is crucial. That's the model of sex. And then the women are apparently given a choice to say no or not. But I use the wonderful research in there by Sheila Kitzinger and others showing that, in fact, women cannot be expected to do this wonderful no. You know, everybody's trained to do. The women must do the no. No! No! I don't want that. No! And of course, if they don't do it, then they are culpable. But as Sheila Kitzinger and others explain, women are not trained. Nobody actually in this society gives a strong no. You can't. You know, if your mother wants you to come over to dinner and you don't want to go, you have to say you're washing your hair. I mean, you do have to say that. You can't just say no. Right? So in this society, no is never simply said. You have to make excuses. That's the only way it can work. And so Sheila Kitzinger's wonderful work says that there are all these little words and phrases and ways of not really saying no or trying to massage no in order to be polite. And of course women are even less able to say no, and girls are particularly unable to say no compared with boys and men. So the idea that a strong no is possible is crazy. Nobody should be teaching consent. We need to transform our understanding of what sex is in many, many ways that I don't even cover in the book. But also to get rid of the male initiative. We must lose it. And then we can start to think about a new model in which women would only want to do what delights them, and only occasionally and when they feel like it. And in an egalitarian situation, imagine, I'm talking something crazy here.
I think what you're talking about is quite recognisable for a lot of lesbians, Sheila, so I don't think it's that crazy. I think a lot of us can manage something along those lines. Anyway.
Yes, I agree. I should have said that as well, and I haven't got very much about that.
But what I was thinking, just still on that topic of consent, I was thinking about how that lack of analysis at the beginning, of understanding that the whole notion of consent is based on a dominant subordinate relationship where one party, the male party, is presumed to be active and have this right, and all that the woman can do is either grant or withhold consent. One of the things that's happened is that, and I've seen plenty of this over the years, is that then where you've got these no doubt very well-meaning campaigns against sexual violence, that consent just gets treated as a sort of, as Kittinger was suggesting in that research, as just a kind of a problem of communication, that you haven't communicated it clearly enough. And I remember, seeing things like, we have to teach young women about consent, and we have to teach young men about consent. Those young men and those young women are in no doubt whatsoever about, if I went up to some young lad and clonked him over the head, he knows totally what consent is and what it isn't. But I think, there've been all of these kinds of campaigns and awareness raising and lots of money and time and resources put into things that actually fail to get to grips with exactly, the nature of that. And as you say, like, we think about consent when we are willing to risk something quite harmful. For example, consent forms with research and things like that. All right, we might not be in physical harm, but we could be, at risk of sharing personal information that's, that could be misused or whatever. And so I think that your analysis of consent is so important, and I really hope it gets taken up, and that all of this. Obviously, it's a big problem that the law is based on that. It's based on that consent model. Sorry, Renate.
I just want to add to this. When we were editing the book, Pauline and myself and Susan from Spinifex, we were all really taken by this chapter on consent. So we excerpted it, changed it a bit around, and sent it to somebody on the public broadcaster, the ABC, who is actually normally quite positively disposed to radical feminist writing, and suggested he publish this. Not even a no, just simply no response. And it's a great pity, because in Australia too, this is being used as the new model, whether it's in regard to pornography or just simply, do you want to have sex? And just the idiocy that a girl has to say, no, I don't. And then not feel like, a total idiot who doesn't want to have fun, or who is just not up to it. And can you imagine what they say in school the next day? Oh, this one didn't want it. It is a totally useless, absolutely useless, or, a concept. So thank you for that chapter in particular.
Thank you. And I should just say that Julia wanted me to talk about consent as it is used, as I do it in the book, in chapter 6 as well, which is the chapter on the rise of kink and sadomasochism. And in there, I quote various authorities on sadomasochism speaking in women's health magazines and so on, all that sort of stuff, saying that the excitement of consent is that it can be violated, and that's the basis of sadomasochism, is that the good top, I was writing about this way back in 1980s, but it's still the same today, the good top will take the bottom, usually the woman, as far as she's prepared to go and a little bit further, and it's the little bit further that is the excitement. So since that's the basis of sadomasochism, is the violation of consent, and again, women are in no position against men to be doing their nose or whatever, or using their stupid safe words. And anyway, never mind.
Sheila, I wondered if you'd maybe say a little bit about chapter 4, which again I think is a really, really important chapter in highlighting the political nature of the male sex right and men's sexual violence.
What I've been wanting to do for some time really was to put together all the ways in which men sexually violate and abuse women in everyday life, in political life, and so on. It's kind of a big task, so I had to leave out pretty much all of rape and so on. So what I wanted to show, and I used human rights concepts to do this. I went back to, you know, the Convention on Human Rights and so on, and I looked at how absurd it is to think that women have the same rights as men, because of course they do not, as a result of simply sexual harassment in the street, which I point out is worse in some countries than in others. It's always about the control of women and getting them off the street, but of course in some countries where women have only recently earned the right to be on the street doing anything at all, sometimes the sexual harassment is more severe, if that makes sense. Right? All the forms of sexual harassment, from just, you know, a comment on appearance or a cheer up, it might never happen, all the way through to touching and so on, actually controls, and we used to say this back in the 70s, as you know, Jonah, we used to say that women's lives are totally constrained by this. I didn't put it in the book, but we used to talk about how women's working lives are constrained as well. I mean, one taxi driver taking a man somewhere late at night and so on. But mainly in the book, I talk about things like women's right to freedom of movement. No. Right? Sexual harassment means that women have to constantly think, can they go there after dark, have the keys between their fingers, look for the lighted windows because they might have to run there. Women are obviously much put off doing all kinds of things because they do not wish to go out after dark, especially if they've had a terrible experience. They are pretty much confined in their homes. And that's the situation. So there's no freedom of movement, freedom of expression. Well, you can see what's happening at the moment in the struggle against the men's rights to sexually use women and transgenderism and so on, which is that we have very little freedom of expression. We have all the terrible abuse online, and many women here, I think, have had experiences of that. And look at freedom of expression around many women's meetings where women are simply not allowed to meet without men trying to aggress against them. And violence is starting now. I'm sorry to say that violence is starting now, as we thought that it would. There's political life, you know, things like the Deputy Prime Minister in Spain because she had a problem around transgenderism, having her an effigy to represent her hung in a public square. I mean, this is kind of extraordinary stuff. So we don't have political freedom. We don't have the right to expression, the right to representation in the way that men do. And it's been so difficult. It's been such a big struggle over the last 50 years to try and get women's representation. And so many women have been involved in this in so many countries, where now that's what's happening. A Deputy Prime Minister has an effigy of her hung from a tree. So we're in a pretty extraordinary situation. There's the right to entertainment. You know, women can't go to music festivals and expect that they're not going to get touched. Something's going to happen at a music festival, and sometimes it's very serious rape, and that has happened at music festivals in Europe over the last few years. So all of those things that women are supposed to have the right to, and it says they have the right to in all of these charters, it applies to men, but absolutely doesn't apply to women because of the male sex right. So in terms of social control, what social control means, that a group of people in the population, or indeed a whole population, are controlled normally. It was invented to cover the army and the police controlling the citizenry for the forces of power, governments and so on. But of course feminists, Kate Millett did this in the beginning, extended the concept of social control to say that men's violence against women effectively limits women, where women may go, what they may do, of course, how they may dress, and many other things. I don't put that stuff in this book because I did a whole book on it. So yes, and I've got sex murder in there, and I have several murders from Australia and several from the UK, when young women were simply returning from work, returning from meeting friends, going for a walk in the park, and so on. So every single thing that a woman might want to do to take part in ordinary life, she has to be afraid that in fact she may be raped and murdered. And people say, well, there's hardly any, is it? You know, it's only a handful a year. Indeed, most women are indeed killed in their own homes, not doing any of these things. But of course, women are afraid. And that's what feminists used to talk about in the 70s and the 80s, that just a few, you know, the fact that you might get killed at 10 o'clock at the bus stop has the effect of chilling the possibility of women feeling free. And we just never talk about it. I mean, I used to talk to my young students about it, about, you know, do you close all the curtains in the evening? And of course I said, yes, of course. And men don't close their curtains. Huh? And, you know, do you look in the back seat of the car before you get in it? Men don't. And so on and so on and so on. There's so many things that are just taken for absolute granted that women do. And we have to be able to talk about, and I don't so much in this book, but what's the effect on how we feel about our own personhood, our being in the world, about the way we can think in the middle of all of that control and all of that violence, because we're not living in the world in the same way that men do.
One of the things that I really liked about that chapter, Sheila, I think it's at the end where you talk about, I think you use the term visual terror, like the visual landscape, and obviously we've seen the mainstreaming of pornography and the pornification of the kind of, you know, public space and the visual world, so women are now having to negotiate probably what is, you know, maybe more than ever, this very sort of, you know, hyper-sexualised environment, or not even just sexualised, but the kind of glorification of sexual violence within our sort of environment as we go about and sort of move around in public space, you know, like tube stations and things like that. And then, of course, we also have the insult that you also talk about, that while we might be seeing some hideous image from a film or from TV or some like, I don't know, underwear advert or something like that, that's, you know, looks like something out of BDSM. At the same time, we see all these rather pious notices from Transport for London saying, you know, be kind and don't hate, and they list all these different protected characteristics which women are conspicuous by our absence from that list. So it just adds insult to injury. And also, you mentioned music festivals. Of course, at the same time as the public space being, you know, this very hostile environment for women, all the environments that women have created have also been subject to such relentless attack over the last few years. So I think that chapter captures it really well. The latter half of the book, where you look at the trajectory of how these, what I would have once upon a time thought of as very, very niche, really quite unimaginable things, then gradually have asserted themselves and are now kind of claiming rights and claiming some kind of protection as oppressed sexual minorities. And I love the way you trace that trajectory, and obviously particularly around transgenderism, but also around child sexual abuse, or inverted commas paedophilia and BDSM, etc. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that, because they all seem to follow a very similar pattern, although transgenderism has obviously sort of really paved the way for the others.
Thank you. In fact, I wrote the paedophilia chapter first, and it was the template for the book, because I just wanted to show what had happened to paedophilia over the years. So the situation is that in the 1960s and 70s, the sexual revolutionaries who told us we were having a wonderful sexual revolution for women, because actually it was about the male sex right gaining greater access to women, right, than had been the case before. But the sexual revolutionaries, like Lars Ullerstam in his wonderful book, The Erotic Minorities, he says that, you know, men mustn't be shamed, they've got to be allowed to come out as paedophiles, sadomasochists and absolutely everything, because it's absolutely crucial, and these are rights. He does say rights, and that's quite nice, because it's 1964, I think it is, so we've got it right in there, the male sex rights. And then Gail Rubin, theorist of lesbian sadomasochism, also says paedophiles, sadomasochists, transvestites. They all say transvestites because at the time transvestism was only understood as a sexual perversion. I mean, nobody thought anybody got strange essences of the opposite sex dropping on them from the heavens. Nobody thought that. Everybody knew in the 1960s and 70s that transvestism was simply a sexual perversion. So they say, along with all the other perversions, transvestism has to be liberated. So I thought this was all really interesting. And in fact, in the article in which she says that, Gail Rubin has a little go at me. This is amazing, isn't it? 1984. Anyway, it's a long time ago. So what I seek to do in the last 4 chapters is look at the way in which, from the sexual revolution onwards, which created the theory for why they've got to be liberated. It's about men's rights and so on and freedom. I look, and of course the sex industry was a crucial part of them developing all of these perversions. But I wanted to look at the mechanisms by which these various men's sexual liberation of perversions movements have developed. And I worked out that they have very similar methods that they use to assert themselves. For instance, they seek to change the law, obviously in terms of paedophilia, more properly called child sex abuse or rape of children, because otherwise it sounds as if it could be something cuddly. So in terms of paedophilia, child sexual abuse, what happened was in the 1970s, when these men came out and they attached themselves to gay rights, as transgenderism has now. These men were all gay. All of the activists were gay. I'm sorry to tell you that in case anybody thought that there was anyone who wasn't. They were all male gay activists, the Gay Activists Alliance, Paedophile Information Exchange, etc., etc. And in the 1970s, there are other women in this room who know this well, who were there at the time. These men started making demands that the age of consent should either be abolished completely or reduced to 4 in some cases. They said 4 would be fine, because I think I've got somebody on record saying that, saying completely might be a bit over the top for the public, so they should say 4. So these groups of child sex abusers were totally respectable. They were writing in reports to government, reports on sexual offences.
One of them was on the committee to reform the sex offences laws. A very respectable gay minister.
Yes. Who did you say, sorry?
A very respectable gay minister
That's
who was
right.
a very nice man who was on the committee to reform the sex offences
And it was
laws.
all being taken
No
seriously.
age
It
of
could
consent.
easily have happened because it was all being taken totally seriously. They were involved with the National Council of Civil Liberties, which is now called Liberty. I mean, there's some wonderful work from a woman journalist who went back in the 80s and 90s to look at what was happening then. And it seems that there were children's homes which had experienced particular positive discrimination to allow gay men to be working them and running them. And there are some very interesting stories about what happened around those children's homes. And Eileen Showalter has produced a lot of information on that, which is really, really interesting stuff. I mean, in Germany, what was happening was that in the 60s and 70s, 11, 12-year-old boys were being put into the houses of paedophiles because it was seen as good for them, mutually good. The paedophiles would find it good, the boys would find it good, and so on. So yes, deliberately so, under the control of a sexologist, this was being done by the state. So the campaign in the 60s and 70s went to a different stage in different countries. But what's significant about the UK is that feminists fought it. We fought it, and by the early 80s, the men in Pi were being arrested for child pornography, and we actually stopped the elimination or reduction of the age of consent. And interestingly, in the research that I was doing around this, I found that others were saying that happened in France, it was the feminists, happened in the US, it was the feminists. So in many countries, and we didn't even know that others were doing it, feminists were coming out to defend children's right not to be violated. So that's really quite interesting stuff. So the campaign by the child sex abusers was stopped, I think mainly by feminists at that time. And this is something I come back to in the final chapter, in case we all get too depressed, is to say, actually, we can be extraordinarily effective. We can do it. Right? And we are doing it right now on transgenderism. Right? So after it was stopped, the forward march of child sex abuse, What's happened more recently, and I cover what's going on now, is, as I'm sure many of you will know, they're not trying to change the law now. They are trying actual other tactics. They're changing language, and that happens around all of the sexual perversions. They try to change language. The sexual perversions are not supposed to be called perversions now because that is negative. They should be called paraphilias, which is things that you love, you know, that are not quite just sex. So it's important to use the right language. So they massage language all the time. So of course the child sex abusers have become minor attracted persons. And there's some extraordinary research by women, unfortunately, criminologists, about how we should be treating the paedophiles, because they say that most of them are really nice now. They don't try to touch children. They're called non-contact paedophiles. There are websites for them. They can use sex dolls. They can fantasize. They can chat to each other and build up their networks. But because none of them would dream of touching a child, they need to be treated as a sexual orientation. That's another thing that they all say. It's biological. Paedophilia, sexual orientation. Sadomasochism, yes, some of them say that. Transgenderism, sexual orientation. I've even seen nappy fetishism. It's a biological, it's a sexual orientation. So the non-contact paedophiles have all these websites where they say that they need to be loved. And these women criminologists write this stuff about. We need to socially accept paedophiles. We must not stigmatize them. If we stigmatize them, they will be unhappy and sexually abuse children. Isn't that a wonderful catch-22? Love paedophiles and they won't touch the kids. Stigmatize paedophiles and they will abuse the kids. It's extraordinary, but this is coming out in academic literature right now. So we've reached a new stage, and there's of course a big campaign to get paedophilia recognised as a sexual orientation, and that's going on through all the sort of, you know, the DSM and so on. So that's what happened with paedophilia. Sadomasochism, very similar. I look at the main organisations that push changing the law so that serious harm can be inflicted and it's still legal, which was a huge problem, of course, for sexual abuse for the violence against women and the violence against women movement in this country. When it found out they were going to change the law back in about 2003, protested and stopped it. Yes, these things can be stopped. So there's a big campaign to change the law to make sure that they can have custody of their children, because the men want to, though they are cutting and piercing and whipping and beating and humiliating and entering into slave contracts with women, where the women have to give them all their money, of course, and call them master, and mustn't make a decision without them, and so on. That's all going on. And the sadomasochist activists want to ensure that that's not a problem with child custody, right? Of course, these men should be able to have custody of their children. But the problem is that sometimes, and I do describe this in the book, they get their boy children to attack the mothers too. And that is a little bit of a problem. And it was a bit of a problem in the case of Barbie Kardashian, this young man who calls himself a woman from Ireland, who I think is now in a women's prison, I think he still is, who wanted to kill his mother, tried to kill his social worker while she was driving him and tore her eyelids pretty much off. And anyway, so he's a bit of a problem, and his father used to get him to attack the mother. Right? So this is simply ordinary sexual violence, but under the name of sadomasochism, it's being normalised. So yes, and then, of course, the transvestism chapter, I mean, you know about that. I will only say a few words. I call it transvestism because I want to go back to the language we were using before the 1990s. It's all this confusing stuff about transgenderism and transsexual. It's a sexual perversion, and therefore that needs to be really clear. And that means I can quote people from the 70s saying it and draw it up to present. So I look there at all the same things, the change in the law, the change in the medical diagnosis, that runs all the way through. The attempt to say it's biological and cannot be changed. And then all of the other techniques to actually... I mean, the thing is that transgenderism has taken over the public world in a way that we haven't quite reached with child sexual abuse or sadomasochism. I mean, there were times back in the 1980s and 90s it looked like sadomasochism had taken over the world, all of the fashion shoots and what women were supposed to wear. It was all handcuffs and studs and black leather and goodness knows what. But I actually think they've got slightly less of that now. But in terms of transvestism, of course, it's gone much further than any of the other perversions in being normalised, and drag goes with it. I mean, you will have noticed that there are drag queens in everything. Art shows, Strictly Come Dancing, whatever it is, every programme on the television
Gardener's
now has...
World.
Sorry?
Gardener's World.
Gardener's World!
Yeah.
Oh my God! Okay.
That was a blow, I must say. Yeah. Yes. No, that's all I've got to say. It was a few weeks ago, a few months ago.
Absolutely everywhere. Something that was just, in the back rooms of pubs in the 60s and 70s, and which all feminists, I think, pretty much recognised as viciously misogynist, is now on your screens every day. It's absolutely everywhere. And of course it's in the public libraries being taught to toddlers. So we are at a sorry pass, I think it has to be said.
Can you say a little bit what you say in your last what you write in your last chapter, the conclusion, and how there is hope? Because we don't want them to just go away and just, drink themselves into oblivion this evening. So can you just talk a little bit about the last chapter, please?
I mean, I've tried to sort of scatter that through what I was saying, really, which is to say that, yes, feminists have achieved, by huge effort against massive forces of power, achieved some things. Like we stopped the elimination of the age of consent. We stopped the legalisation of serious violence in the name of sadomasochism. We are going to stop the gender identity movement. I mean, there's no doubt. Yeah. But the thing is, they went too far. And I think I do say in the book, this is, imperial overreach. Yeah. Because by the transgenderism stuff is imperial overreach, right? When they want to be, masturbating in our toilets all over the blooming place, they have gone a bit far. And the result of it is a big new movement of feminism is developing, a terrific new feminism. What I hadn't got the chance to say, but I do say at some length in the book, is what the result, for instance, of the mainstreaming of sadomasochism has been, because it started out in the 1980s. There were the so-called feminist sex wars because it was lesbian sadomasochism. Hets weren't doing it, they weren't having to do it. Lesbian sadomasochism came over from the States and was promoted like a political campaign. There was all the special costumes, they went to all the meetings, they went to the marches. There was nothing private or personal about it, like how people say, it's just what you do in the bedroom, shouldn't be anybody's concern. This was very, 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 very political. So that moved on, as I think we knew that it would, from being a lesbian and gay thing. It originally came from gay men, particularly, into the heterosexual community, with the help, of course, of the developing pornography industry, for whom sadomasochism was the stock in trade from the very beginning. The eroticizing of violence was really what it was about. So it moved into the heterosexual community, so that now strangulation or choking and breath play, it's sometimes called breath play, is now absolutely mainstream. It's in, Women's Health, online, and all of these magazines supposedly for women, where they say you might want to start off with a bit of a scarf. And they talk about how having they don't say a man, having someone's hands round your neck can give you this wonderful, wonderful feeling. Yeah, they actually say this in Women's Health magazines, right? And they also say it's the most equal and egalitarian sex you can ever do. They're saying that in the Women's Health magazines because of consent, because of consent, and so on and so on. So we have got to that point, and part of the result of that is the sex murders in which men are strangling women, and in this country supposedly they can't use the sex game gone wrong defence anymore. But, it is normally being used everywhere else. And I would ask you to consider, back in the 1970s, the women's liberation movement in Britain constructed something called the 7 demands. Right? These were sort of seen as basic to what you needed to have as a feminist movement. Well, not hugely radical, but, kind of basic. And one of them was a self-defined sexuality for women.
Yeah.
And where are we now? Right? In those days, in the 1970s, we actually thought we could, totally transform sex, and it'd be completely different. Yeah, it's been totally transformed. In the 1970s, ordinary heterosexual women were not having to suffer choking or even anal sex. All the teenage girls now are having to do anal sex, some of whom have their sphincters very severely damaged and damaged for the rest of their lives. I mean, that's where we are now. And I don't want to depress you, and I know there's a lot of energy in this room and we're going to stop it, but that is, unfortunately, where we are now.
Because there seems to be a global conversation at the minute about slavery and anti-slavery, and I think I became a feminist because I read Pornography and Civil Rights, which has a strong abolitionist message, that women are not property. Yet we've got this global conversation about anti-slavery, returning objects back to museums, and decolonizing the agenda. And yet everyone's still watching porn where someone's enacting this master-slave relationship. And not even that, if you type in master-slave, even all these anti-colonialists, all of them are into this sadomasochist stuff as well. It seems like you can be a master and slave, you can be a master and slave in the bedroom, and it seems to be completely isolated from what's going on. So I wonder if there's a case to be made as radical feminists, how we could actually reframe and re-engage with this public conversation around this kind of politics of egalitarian sexuality that we want to promote.
I mean, we have tried. I was involved in, as was Sandra, in the very first anti-pornography group in this country, in London, back in 1977, 78. So we've tried many kinds of language. Whether we can suddenly find a new kind of language that we can use, I don't know. But the situation is that the oppression of women is tremendously exciting. The excitement that men get from it hugely powers the whole institution of male domination. I mean, that's what's in it for them. That's the kick, more than blooming anything else, I think. So managing to get men or most women to take seriously the fact that we're talking about a horrendous propaganda of woman hatred, as Kathleen Barry used to call it, and vicious master-slave relationships. I mean, I don't know how we're going to do that. I'm not working on porn now. I'd like to know what the women who are working on porn now are doing in terms of the language they're talking about using and the strategies. But I cannot say. But yes, I mean, women are, well, horrendous things are happening to women. Women are being murdered. Women are being horrendously abused in pornography. Nobody takes it seriously because it's women. And women are not seen as really human, as you know. In the 70s and 80s, when very many of us in this room, because there are quite a few, actually became lesbians, or you're not allowed to say that yet now, because there's this tremendous political campaign to say that if you've ever been near a penis or seen one, you cannot ever be a lesbian. I mean, it's big out there, it's big out there, always have been, gold stars, the real ones. We didn't have that problem in the 70s and 80s. We didn't have lots of lesbians running around saying, you can't be a lesbian because you once saw a man take his trousers off, or anything of that kind. I mean, we did not have that problem. But apart from that little difficulty, and we don't want to get into that today, back in the 70s and 80s, when many of us became lesbians and were determined to change what sex was different from what it is now. The extraordinary violence and humiliation and degradation practices that an ordinary part of heterosexuality now were not then, and yet we were immensely critical at that time. We formed the anti-pornography group when we only had Playboy magazine to look at. Imagine that. Well, there were a few videos, but we didn't look at the videos. But I mean, there was nothing like what's going on now. So the problem is now, women aren't even allowed to consider becoming lesbians because they're told you can't, you'll never be a real one, and you'll always be called a straight being or bisexual or whatever, you've got no right. At the same time, as sex has become something so extraordinarily frightening and distressing in the huge numbers of heterosexual relationships, that where you'd expect us to be in a position where women are coming out in their millions and they are in Korea. And I'm thinking it's going to start in Japan too now, because, you know, My Beauty and Misogyny was published there in July and sold out in a month. So I think it's moving across. But the interesting thing is, in this side of the world, the extraordinary radicalism that we had then about heterosexuality, about beauty practices, about all kinds of things, doesn't exist here, but it absolutely exists in Korea. It absolutely is beginning to exist in Japan, and that's so exciting, is that we're being led by the East now, and that's a really interesting situation to be in.